The next speaker is Henri Servaes from the London Business School. Henri is presenting the paper, Does Corporate Culture Add Value? Evidence from the Harvey Weinstein scandal and the Me Too movement. Henri, you have 30 minutes.
Thank you, Ramin. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this paper on the program. This is joint work with Carl Linz from Utah, Lucas Roth from Alberta, and Aneta Mayo from the London School of Economics. And so what are we asking in this paper? We are studying one specific element of corporate culture, namely the extent to which a firm discriminates on the basis of sex. And we're going to see whether that one element of corporate culture has an impact on the value of the firm. And so in terms of the fit with this conference on sustainability and corporate governance, if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you see that gender equality is one of them. So that's where this fits in. Now, why this paper? If you look at survey evidence, you will find that executives generally think that improving culture is value creating. And the media and consulting companies, they also advocate at least a positive valuation effect of culture. But actually the academic evidence there is suggestive of a correlation between culture and value, but we actually have relatively little evidence of a causal relation. Luigi Guizzo and co-authors have a paper showing such a correlation, but they say themselves that they don't really have any causal evidence. There's also some evidence that firms with a good culture, if you proxy it by being among the list of the best companies to work for, that such companies outperform the stock market subsequently, and that seems to be good evidence. But actually, more recent research suggests that if employees rate their company as being one of the best places to work for, that may have less to do with culture and the quality of the workplace, but more with the fact that if things are going well inside the firm and if future profitability is going to be high because, for example, the order book is large, that employees give better reviews and like the company more. And so in essence, these reviews are just a revelation of private inside information to the market, which then later, when the information becomes public, yields higher stock returns. But it still doesn't speak to the true value of corporate culture as such. Now, the problem with studying culture is kind of exacerbated by the fact that it's very difficult to define culture. And many authors have come up with various definitions. A definition that's gained a lot of traction recently, that's been used by John Graham in his survey, and also by Guizzo and others, is that culture is essentially a set of norms and values that are widely shared and strongly held throughout the organization. But of course, if you talk about norms and values, it's not relatively straightforward to measure what these norms and values would be. And so what we do is we are modest in what we want to achieve. We focus just on one element of corporate culture, but we think is a very important element of corporate culture, namely the extent to which a firm discriminates on the basis of sex, or of course, the inverse, the extent to which the culture is not sexist. We think this is an important element, and this also helps us with what we're trying to achieve in this paper. We are going to argue that sexism, or the lack of sexism, has a measurable dimension, and that's important if we want to ascribe value consequences to culture. And then the second element is that this particular element of culture also experienced an unexpected shock to its importance relatively recently. And with these two things in mind, we can, I think, say something about the value of at least one element of corporate culture. So first, how are we going to measure this lack of sexism? And what we're going to do is we're going to use female leadership in the organization. Our primary measure is actually whether there's a woman among the top 5 highest paid executives in a corporation. And we believe that there are many reasons why this is a good metric for the lack of sexism in an organization. Now, first, of course, if a firm is really sexist or even worse, misogynist, if such a culture exists, it's unlikely that women would have actually made it to the C-suite of the organization and be among the highest paid executives. But there's also other evidence to back this up. There's survey evidence from the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, where they ask what the problems are, what prevents, in some sense, women from achieving top leadership positions. And they ask both men and women in organizations. And if you look at the second response, 63% of all respondents say that corporate culture is important in preventing women from achieving top leadership positions. It's a little bit higher for women than for men, but certainly a large fraction of the respondents think that culture is important. The World Economic Forum has also studied this element, and they've put out a report with a title saying the key to closing the gender pay gap is essentially putting more women in charge. So again, an organization with a large gender pay gap may have more problems of sexism, and we would avoid that if we put more women in charge, according to the World Economic Forum. There's also academic evidence suggesting that the gender pay gap, and so the treatment of women in some sense, is better in organizations when there are women in leadership positions. Using various approaches, there are at least 2 papers who show that the gender pay gap is reduced when women are in leadership positions. And finally, maybe companies also see the lack of sexism and inclusiveness and diversity, also see that very much as an element of culture. And this comes from the Microsoft annual report, and they have a section on culture. And within that section, what do they talk about? They talk about diversity, inclusiveness. They talk about their attempts to increase the number of women in corporate VP positions over time. So there are, I think, lots of arguments, and including some academic evidence as well, to suggest that the lack of sexism certainly is an element of corporate culture. So that's for the measurement. So we're going to measure the lack of sexism, at least, by looking as to whether women are among the top 5 executives. Now, what about measuring the changes, measuring the importance? So we're going to look at the Harvey Weinstein scandal and the Me Too movement as essentially shocks to the importance of having a non-sexist corporate culture. And I think you're all familiar with these events, so I'm not going to talk about them in great detail. But the Harvey Weinstein event, got announced on the 5th and the 6th of October 2017. It, of course, received massive media attention. And then things were sort of quiet for a week. But then the Me Too movement started the 15th of October when Alyssa Milano, an actress, encouraged spreading this Me Too hashtag to draw attention to widespread harassment in the workplace. And if you look at Google searches, then Me Too, of course, received a lot of searches, but also sexual harassment in the workplace hit an all-time high. And of course, once the Me Too movement started, there were then additional revelations of harassment in the workplace. And so we believe that these 2 events highlighted the importance of having a non-sexist culture, and certainly that increased attention that was paid to these events in some sense serve as a shock to their importance, and we're going to exploit that shock to see whether we can ascribe value to having a non-sexist culture in an organization. Now, there are 2 interpretations of what occurred on those days and those periods. So the first one is that essentially the lack of sexism has become more salient. And as a result, shareholders reevaluated the benefits in an organization of having a non-sexist culture. Now, and of course, that could then, they could look at this in a broader sense by also looking at culture more broadly and rethinking the importance of culture more broadly. Now, importantly, for this to happen, we don't need any real effects. We don't need the profitability of the companies to improve afterwards and before. Good culture may have always been valued, may have always been value created, but it was not valued because investors did not pay enough attention to it. And so the first interpretation is that as a result of these events, paying more attention to culture and to the lack of sexism led to an increase in the value of the firm because it's become a more salient event, but that shouldn't necessarily be followed by actual changes in profitability. The second interpretation is that the payoffs to having a non-sexist culture actually increased because there was more awareness of sexual harassment. This would impose higher costs on firms. And in addition, the society at large, customers, employees now pay more attention to culture, rewarding firms more that have a non-sexist culture relative to those firms that have a sexist culture. This would also lead to an increase in value. It would also lead to expectations of improvements in performance, but now you would also actually see actual improvements in the operating performance of those firms. And then finally, before I get to our data, we also study the interactions between corporate culture and the culture of the industry in which the firm operates, and indeed societal culture where the firm operates. And we think that there could be important interaction effects. And so we're going to measure industry culture by looking at the fraction of women in executive positions in the industry in which the firm operates. And we're going to measure societal culture, at least with respect to this element, by looking at the gender pay gap and other measures of sexism in the state where the firm is headquartered. And we have two additional predictions that come out of our analysis, which is we believe that corporate culture should matter more when the industry and the societal culture is weaker. If the culture in the industry, if there is less sexism in the industry and less sexism in the state where the firm operates, then maybe having less sexism at the firm level doesn't matter because the entire environment is already conducive to not having a sexist culture. And then there is a second prediction, which is that the industry culture itself may affect value, and that the culture of the society where the firm operates may also affect value in relation to the two events we study. And the argument is that if the industry and the societal culture is less sexist, then the firms that operate in those industries and in those states are also going to benefit during these events, whether the firm itself has women in leadership positions or not. So where are we going to get the data to study this? Our initial sample comes from the executive comp database, which covers S&P 1500 firms. And we're looking at the top 5 highest paid executives for the last fiscal year prior to October 2017. Recall that the events happened early October. And to measure non-sexist culture, we're simply going to take the fraction of the top 5 executives that are female. And then we're also going to have an indicator variable to measure whether there is at least one woman among the top 5 executives. For control variables or other variables that we use for measurement, we use Board-X data. From Board-X data, we will be able to compute the fraction of the board that is female. And then for further tests that we conduct later, we also go beyond the C-suite and we look at the fraction of the senior management of the firm. So at the vice president level, that is also female. And we're going to, of course, use data before our event. And then to see whether this culture of non-sexism carries over in the culture of the company more broadly, we will also conduct our tests using Glassdoor culture ratings, which are based on employee reviews. But I'll come back to that later. Just some quick summary statistics. So only 6% of the top 5 executives are women in our sample. Only 26% of the firms have at least one woman among their top 5 executives at all. Only 4% of the firms have female CEOs. And this actually contrasts quite a bit to the board membership. We find that 17% of all board members are female, so that's 3 times as high as for executives. And 87% of all firms have at least one woman on the board. So there's quite a substantial contrast between female representation on the board and female representation in the executive suite. So how are we going to assess whether firms with more women in top management earned excess returns during the events we study? We're going to conduct a very simple panel regressions over a short period of time, and that's important for our research design. We're going to look at a 3-month period from September 2017 to November 17. We're going to look at the daily returns of those firms, raw returns. We'll regress them on firm fixed effects, And of course, these firm fixed effects are essentially going to capture the normal returns, whether they're driven by size or beta or whatever it is. That's all going to be captured by the firm fixed effect. We're also going to include time fixed effects, so time dummies. And then we're going to have an interaction between the event days and our measure of female leadership. And the coefficient on that interaction term is essentially going to capture the excess return that's earned by firms with female leadership relative to other firms during the event window that we study. What are the windows we use? For the Weinstein event, we use the 5th and the 6th of October. And then for the Me Too movement, we start the 15th of October, which is when the Me Too movement was launched, and we run it for the next 2 weeks. And the assumption is that over that 2-week period, the market has had plenty of time to reconsider the value of having a non-sexist culture. Of course, we also see whether there's any reversal in the returns that we study. So let me just show you some of the regression models we estimate. So these are the coefficients on the female measures we use. And as I said, we measure female leadership using the fraction of the top 5 that's female, or an indicator whether the top 5 that's female. So this is the return earned on a daily basis on the 5th and the 6th of October. And these are the extra returns earned on a daily basis from the 15th to the 27th of October. So that's the Me Too movement. The first number is the coefficient, and the second number is the p-value. So you can see that we have positive abnormal returns on these days, and they're highly significant. The in-between period and the period after the Me Too movement window that we consider, there is essentially not much going on. So there certainly is not a reversal of these returns. Now, are these big numbers or are these small numbers? Well, if you just look at the 5th and the 6th of October for the Harvey Weinstein event, and if you add one top 5 female executive to the executive suite, then you get abnormal returns of about 30 basis points, which is modest, significant, but modest. If you then look at the Me Too movement during that period, if you add one additional top 5 female executive, you get an additional return of about 1.1% over the 10-day trading window. So combined, having one more woman in the executive suite yielded excess returns for firms of about 1.4% or so. We then conduct a number of further tests. First, we ask ourselves whether female CEOs drive the result. And so that's not the case. We do not find that female CEOs have additional explanatory power beyond being part of the top 5. Now, of course, only 4% of the firms have female CEOs, so it might be very difficult to pick this up. We also study female board membership. And this is quite important. And, if you look at the research on female leadership, the majority of that research is actually focused not on female executives, but on female board memberships. And policymakers have also focused on female board membership, and many countries, and I think at least one US state, now imposes board quotas. And there's also some evidence that firms with more female directors then are more likely to hire female executives. But our findings are not a female director effect. They really are a female executive effect. So our findings hold after we control for the presence of women on the board. And in fact, we do not find that the fraction of women on the board affects the value change during the Weinstein and the Me Too events. And so while we are not saying that having female representation on the board is not important, at least in this setting, what the market is really cares about is having women among the top leadership of the organization. We also want to assess whether our metric of female leadership, measured at the C-suite, at the executive level among the top 5 executives, whether that result really carries through when you study female leadership more broadly. So we look at the level below the C-suite. And so from Boardex, we are going to count all the VPs in the organization, removing assistant and associate VPs because we want some leadership level. So all the VPs in the organization, and we simply compute the fraction of VPs that are female. And then we re-estimate our regression models. And again, I'm just showing you the main models with the fraction of senior management, so the fraction of VPs that are female, and then an indicator whether there is at least one woman among the VPs in the organization. And say, based on this fifth model, if you would increase the number of VPs by about 20%, you get about 30 basis points excess return over the Weinstein event, and another 50 basis points excess returns over the Me Too event. So combined about 0.8%. So smaller than for the top level executives, but still, still highly significant and substantial. We then see whether our findings on female representation among the top managers of the firm carry through when we measure culture more broadly. And we're doing this using the Glassdoor data. Glassdoor is an employee review website, and they ask employees to rate their firms on a variety of elements. But one of the elements that they also look at is a culture and value measure. And so we obtain that data, making sure we have a sufficient number of reviews for it to be meaningful. And then we essentially re-estimate our models, but now instead of looking at female leadership, we regress the returns during the Weinstein and the Me Too events on the Glassdoor culture rating. And again, we find that increasing the Glassdoor culture rating, say by 1 standard deviation, leads to excess returns of about 20 basis points around the Weinstein event, and another 70 basis points around the Me Too event. So this suggests that the female leadership metric also says something about culture more broadly, because our results also hold using that metric. Next, we look at industry and societal culture spillover effects, as I argued earlier. And so the first thing we do is we examine whether female leadership effect is stronger when societal culture is in some sense more sexist, and when the industry has fewer women in executive positions. And that is indeed what we find. We find that female leadership is particularly important when there are fewer women in executive positions in the industry, when the states in which the firm is headquartered are more sexist, and when the firms in the states, for firms in states that have a higher gender pay gap. And so the economic effect, because it's concentrated particularly in those firms, is essentially twice as large. And so our interpretation is essentially that the industry and the societal culture where the firm operates and the corporate culture of non-sexism are really substitutes for each other. By the way, if you want to get a sense of sexism in the US, the darker states are the ones that are deemed to be more sexist, but I'm sure you had a sense of this already. And then finally, we also look at industry and societal culture effects by themselves. And we do find that firms in industries with more women in executive positions, as well as firms headquarters in states with low levels of sexism and a low gender pay gap, they also did well. They also earned positive abnormal returns over the Weinstein and the Me Too periods. Irrespective of whether they had a woman in the executive leadership team or not. So firms with a good industry culture and firms located in states that were less sexist and had a lower gender pay gap were also rewarded during those events. And the effect is also substantial. It's a 2% plus abnormal return. We then go back to testing the two possible interpretations of our results. One suggests that this has just become more salient. We don't expect any real effects. Essentially, what this would mean is the market did not pay enough attention to the quality of firms with female leadership, to the fact that these were maybe sexist firms. And so firms with female leadership, non-sexist firms, were essentially undervalued prior to these events. And so you would expect, after the events we study, you would expect analysts to adjust maybe their earnings forecasts, but you would not necessarily expect actual profitability to increase. Again, the firms were always going to create more value, but the market just didn't appreciate it. And the second interpretation, we would expect some real effects because a non-sexist culture is now more rewarded because stakeholders essentially change their behavior with respect to those firms. So the first thing we do is we look at analyst forecast revisions. What do? For each analyst that follows the firms, we look at the last forecast made before the events and the first forecast made after the events, considering only forecasts in the 100-day window surrounding the events. And we look at forecasts for profits for fiscal year ends between December 2017 and November 2018. So that's essentially, that would have all possible fiscal year ends for all firms. And our metric is the forecast as a fraction of the stock price.
5 minutes, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, 5 minutes, great. And so what do? We estimate the regression of the forecast by analyst T for firm I made at time T. And we estimate that regression on firm fixed effects, analyst fixed effects, time of forecast fixed effects. And then we have a post-event dummy, which is one after the events, interacted with whether you have women in top leadership or not. And so essentially the coefficient on this interaction is going to capture the change in earnings forecasts after the event. Let me show you just some of the regressions. So this is for all fiscal year ends from December to November December 17 to November 2018. And you can use as a measure the fraction of women in top 5 or an indicator. And you can see that the coefficient on the interaction between female leadership and the post period is positive and statistically significant. Now, what does this mean economically? Well, if you take model number 3, if you add 1 woman to the executive team, this is going to imply an increase in analyst forecast of about 3.3%. So analysts project that after the event relative to before, relative to firms without women in the top leadership team, that their profits are going to be 3.3% higher. Then we look at various metrics of real effects, operating profitability, gross margin, sales growth. We look at this using quarterly data from a period before and a period after the events. We estimate the regression of performance on firm fixed effects, industry times time fixed effects, the size of the firm, and again, a post-event interacted with the female measure. But essentially, we do not find any real effects there. Now, it is entirely possible that it takes longer for the real effects to materialize, that it is difficult to pick up real effects because profitability is very volatile. It's also possible that firms are changing their behavior. So sexist firms are changing their behavior. And so as a result of the change in their behavior, maybe you wouldn't see the real effects anymore because they're cleaning up their act. So we are not totally set on that yet. But at this point, given that there are no real effects, this evidence seems to suggest the fact that firms with a non-sexist culture were undervalued by the market relative to the Weinstein and the Me Too events, and that the stock price reaction that we document corrects for this mispricing. So to conclude, I think we have strong evidence to suggest that the market values a non-sexist culture, as shown by the stock price changes during the Weinstein and the Me Too events. This effect is also present in industries with a large fraction of women in executive positions. So there's an industry effect as well. And the effect is also present in states with lower levels of gender pay gap, gender pay inequality, and lower levels of sexism. So societal and culture and corporate culture essentially interact, and so does industry and corporate culture. We believe that this is due to a revaluation that possibly corrects for prior mispricing of firms that have a non-sexist culture. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Henri. The discussant is Zacharias Sautner from the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management.
Thank you. Okay, you can all see it? Perfect. So thank you, first of all, to the organizers for the opportunity to read and discuss this paper and also to participate in this great event. You know, I closely follow this, you know, research team and their work. So, you know, I would have probably read this paper anyhow. So it was a kind of a good opportunity now to also read it from the perspective of a discussant and write down some comments. So I'm not going to summarize. I think Henri did a great job. Let me start with a brief assessment and an overview of my comments and then jump right into my suggestions. I think the paper has all the ingredients that you need for a great paper, for a successful paper, which, by the way, is also going to be a paper here that is going to bridge different areas, right? Because it's a topic that's been discussed in finance, but also in management and other literatures within business. It's very topical, it's highly relevant. I think little you know, needs to be added here. What I like a lot with the paper is that it has a very clear question, very clear answers, in a very clever idea to measure the value of corporate culture. So what I'll do is I'll focus mostly on some additional aspects that I would like to have discussed, and many of them are related to how to interpret the results in the paper. The first comment I have is related basically to the role of legal aspects that, you know, may provide an alternative or additional interpretation of the results. So there's a very nice paper in the Columbia Law Review by Hamill and Lund, which argues that corporations can be liable for allowing sexual misconduct by their executives, both from a kind of corporate law and a securities law perspective. Now, why is this relevant here? Well, because the Weinstein scandal led to lawsuits by shareholders and departures of executives. So, for example, a pension fund filed a lawsuit against LibertyTax and its CEO because he had a sexual relationship with female employees. And of course, you know, these lawsuits are associated with very big reputational and financial costs for firms. Now, why is this relevant here? Well, because of course, you know, sexual misconduct and subsequent lawsuits should be less likely, kind of almost by definition, when firms have less female executives. So I was wondering to what extent the kind of outperformance you capture here is a reflection of relatively lower litigation risks in firms where you have more female executives in the top management team. Related to this, also something that could be interesting to do is to see to what extent these announcement returns, these cars around the scandal help you predict future lawsuits in the subsequent period. So that would kind of be consistent with this narrative. Second comment, it's more about a kind of economic size of the effect. So it's less about, you know, whether the effect is there. I think it's there. It's more about how to interpret the magnitude of the results. And like Henri said, some of them, you know, seem a little bit modest at first glance. But I think this is actually also because of the design of your tests. Because it could be that there may not just be a positive effect among firms with female executives from before to after the scandal. That is, there may not just be a shock to the treatment group, you know, defined here as firms that have a woman in the executive team, but also a shock to the control group. So why is this? Well, firms without female executives may actually benefit from the Weinstein scandal because it makes it more likely that women are being hired moving forward, right? And we know that more women may increase performance. It's actually also in the sample. Firms with female executives have a higher profitability. So therefore, it also may be that in the treatment group, you have a kind of positive reaction. Now, of course, the estimates that you derive are kind of by comparing treatment and control group. So now if you have a treatment effect and a control group effect, the economic magnitude of the effect is kind of confounded. Kind of in econometric terms, this is akin to a violation of the stable unit treatment value assumption, right? So both the treatment and the control group are being affected. Now, that doesn't have an impact on interpretation, but it has an impact on how kind of large we likely kind of should see the value of corporate culture to be, right? So it could be that the true value effect of corporate culture may actually be larger than what you document in this paper. So also here, it's not any additional tests to perform, but it could be, adding a paragraph kind of mentioning this possibility. Comment 3, on the return calculations. And I was wondering how to interpret these event returns, right? So they were using these raw returns, and then they were using these firm fixed effects, which was to compare a firm's raw returns in the event window to the same firm's returns in the period outside of the window, which I think is very plausible. But I was then wondering whether, in light of these firm fixed effects, we can really say that firms, quote now, firms with female top executives earned excess returns relative to firms without women among the highest paid executives, or whether such a comparison should rather be derived when not using firm fixed effects. Because I was thinking of a firm fixed effect like, taking the same firm and looking at, the value before and after, or the return before and after, rather than kind of a cross-sectional comparison. So that's something that, may be useful to discuss. And I think it would also be nice to show some results in the paper for the cars, kind of not using raw returns. Again, that's not going to change much because you already mentioned in the footnote 9 that results are robust. But I think it's something that could be useful to add. Last comment on kind of women executives. So of course, a key assumption that is underlying the argument is the following, quote now, we posit that firms with one or more women among the top 5 compensated executives are unlikely to have a culture that tolerates misogyny and sexual harassment. Seems, of course, very plausible, I agree, but a little bit more could be done to justify this assumption. And one counter example is you followed this probably also in the news, Susan Scott of Fox News. So she was a CEO, a woman CEO, but there have been reports in the media that she's been accused of helping enforce former CEO Ailey's miniskirt dress code for women, a claim that she denied to HuffPost last year. She was also named in at least 2 sexual harassment complaints herself. Of course, this may just be an exception. What you're estimating are average effects, absolutely. But it also suggests that that corporate culture or a lack of sexism may need more than just women in the C-suite. Again, not really something that you need to work on, but more on kind of potential ideas also to look at moving forward. 2 smaller comments. I was puzzled about the lack of a result for the CEO dummy, female CEO dummy. Of course, you mentioned that you have only 4% of the observations here, but I think maybe you can provide a little bit more here. And then also a smaller comment on the state level evidence. I was intrigued whether it's maybe not just the jurisdictions, or maybe not primarily the jurisdictions in the locations of the headquarters, but rather where your operations are, when it comes to kind of measuring to what extent there is a lack or existence of kind of sexist culture based on these state laws. Overall, a very beautiful paper that I enjoyed a lot. Again, I think there's very little you need to do in terms of additional tests or results. It would be just a little bit of a fine-tuning of the interpretations. So I can recommend this paper to everyone interested in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Henri, we have, would you like to respond? We have minutes and also for a couple of questions.
Sure. Zacharias, thank you so much for these great comments. We will certainly take them to heart. The issue of litigation risk. I mean, we are still looking further into litigation. We do think this says something about culture more broadly. We also thought that if it was really about litigation, we should see some real effects, which we don't find. So that seemed to suggest that litigation was not necessarily changing. But as I said, that's still a bit of work in progress. In terms of the control group, I mean, I agreed, of course, that this was also maybe a wake-up call for sexist firms, and in that sense, what we're just capturing is the difference. And so that's something we could stress. In some sense, what we were capturing then would be almost a lower bound on the value effect. So I think that's a very good idea. I mean, the reason we did fixed effects is we wanted to capture kind of all the normal returns for the firm, but we have done this with, with traditional abnormal returns and cars, and we get the same results. We just thought this was the cleanest way of showing this, but our results are certainly robust. Is having a top 5 female executive really a good metric for the lack of sexism, and your Susanna Scott example? I mean, of course, we try to delve deeper now, looking at vice presidents, so looking deeper into the organization as well. I mean, we do think that, based on, again, the survey evidence that we show and some of the academic evidence, it does seem to suggest that having a woman on top leads to less sexism in the organization. There seems to be both anecdotal evidence as well as some survey evidence as well as academic evidence. But of course, it's not going to be perfect by no means. We could, dig a little bit deeper into that. And then finally, I mean, we looked at the headquarters state mainly because we were kind of focused on of course, on the location of the executives in the first place and on problems within the firm. But it is true that headquarters and operations are not always correlated, and we should maybe look into that more carefully. But thank you so much for taking the time to go through the paper and for these great comments. Thank you.
All right, so we have time for a couple of questions. Per kindly raised his hand. Okay, Per, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm just wondering a little bit about the mechanism. I mean, lawsuits was one thing that was mentioned. The other one is that it has something to do with attracting human capital, that women don't want to work for sexist firms, and you become more aware of this after the. I mean, you have another story, I guess, which is on sort of attention. But do you have any data on employees of these firms and the fraction of female employees, and whether that changed in the period after, or something like that?
It's a great question. So we haven't looked at the fraction of employees that are female in the organization, because your comments kind of based on the notion that if this is an industry with fewer women in executive positions, should the effect really be stronger, right? That was kind of the question you formulated, because maybe those organizations don't have a lot of women further down in the organization. So if it's about female talent, maybe you wouldn't expect this. But if it's about the treatment of the fewer women that are there, then maybe you would, of course, expect this.
But if there are no women working, or very few women that are badly treated, would that really have big effects on operating performance? I mean, it seems a little. So to have some operating performance results, it seems like that would have to rely somehow on attracting human capital.
No, it doesn't need to be. I mean,
or maybe it's a sign of having a better corporate culture just overall,
right?
Not just necessarily with gender.
That operating performance can also come from from the customer saying, I don't want to deal with sexist firms anymore. So it could come from a variety of angles.
Right. So, but I guess it would be interesting to explore the mechanisms more, right? I mean, and that it's just sort of something simple like, oh, now we worry about these firms getting lawsuits, or oh, I saw these female executives speak out a lot after Harvey Weinstein, and then those stocks get a lot of attention and people buy. I mean, other things that really don't have to do with corporate culture.
Good suggestions, Per. Thank you.
And I'd like to add, we are still trying to work through this, because there's got to be something out there. It's just sometimes hard to pick up in noisy estimations. But I mean, maybe there won't be, but we're trying still on this part of the paper.
This brings us to the end of the second day of the SHoF ECGI Conference, Sustainable Finance and Corporate Governance. I would like to thank all the presenters and discussants, as well as the attendees, for an interesting afternoon filled with some great insights. Please join us again tomorrow for the third and last day of the conference. We start at 2 p.m. Stockholm time. And in the meantime, I wish you very much, I wish you a wonderful remaining Saturday, and thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.